what is strewing and how can it help a PDA child or teen? So this is a question that I've seen in my comments on Instagram and on Facebook. So I thought I would take some time today to give you guys a definition, give you guys examples, and we can actually categorize the different types of strewing so that it's easier to use in your home with your PDA child or teen and to experiment to see if it helps with avoidance and engagement. So before I define strewing, I'm going to start with a story to illustrate how I learned about how this could be such an impactful tool in your home. Okay, so when my son Cooper was younger, I was very, very intent on him learning to read. And I was also very intent on him eating healthy foods. Okay, so these were two of my big things as a mother when I first became a mother. So when I used to still live in the Washington, D.C. area, and my son was, 2, 3, 4 years old, I was really focused on, baby-led weaning, all organic stuff, reading, all the things. I'm sure many of you can identify with that. So let's start with reading. As I was trying to get him to read, the more I tried to read to him, the more he would do what I now understand as equalizing or controlling behavior in order to get back to a sense of control. But what that looked like was I would be reading a book to him, and he would say, "No, stop," and he would want to change the words or the story. So I ended up intuitively in this space where every night we had this very unique routine where it had to be a certain number of books and a certain number of songs and a certain number of roughhousing iterations, but he would make me change the words and the storyline to silly things like poop and fart and all the things, because otherwise he would not read the book with me. Right? And this was long before I knew anything about neurodiversity, sensory processing disorder. I had never heard of PDA, etc. And then as he started to get a little bit older and my second son, William, was born and things started to move towards nervous system burnout, it was a more explicit rejection of reading. So talking about books, letting me read to him at all, different games with letters. I got all the Montessori stuff. I, allowed him to experiment with video games that would help him learn to read, but he would just entirely reject this. I'm going to remove my, my little bracelets because as I talk, they're making noise that is distracting me. Okay. So he was just completely rejecting anything that had to do with reading. At the same time, his eating was getting more and more controlled, more and more refusal, more and more avoidance, right? And so what did we do? We went into feeding therapy and read the parenting books about all the different types of, playful exposure and different color dynamics. And we actually did what's called SOS feeding, which is a 32-step process to expose the child to new foods. And they get exposed to them just by being in the same room as them first, and then they move all the way up to licking and spitting, smelling, all the way up to putting it in their mouth. Okay, but the more that we did this, the more he would reject food, or in feeding therapy, he would add a food which we thought was a bridge to his sensory experience, but then he'd drop another, which was the controlling behavior to get back to a place of him feeling nervous system safety, okay? So at the time, the root cause of resistance that I was assuming was going on for both of these things was incorrect, right? So I thought he doesn't like reading. He's not interested in reading. Perhaps it's part of his temperament. Perhaps he has a learning disability. Perhaps he's dyslexic, because I was also noticing that when he would write everything backwards or start the sentence backwards. Okay, and then for the eating, I would assume the root cause was sensory-based, which did interact with his nervous system activation from PDA, but was not the primary root cause. Okay, this is how I learned about strewing, which we're going to get to, accidentally because I started to notice things. So let's take reading. I'll give you an anecdote. One time, now we were in Michigan, we were homeschooling, and I was cleaning up all these beads we were using to make art projects. And I had started to learn about PDA, and I was not trying to make him read. We had stopped reading at night because he would physically fight me on it, and he was in burnout, and I wouldn't even talk about it. But I remember picking up these beads, and I was looking at them just to myself because they had letters on them of the alphabet. And he came over and he's like, "What are those letters, Mama?" And then he started asking me, like, what sound does it make? And can we put them together? And like, he was leading this actual like engagement in literacy. And I was just stunned, like, oh, maybe he does have an interest in reading. Maybe he is interested in learning, which is the assumption, a different assumption than I had after all the rejection, right? So why did he all of a sudden show an interest in reading when my assumption was he was either dyslexic, no interest in reading, or just didn't have a temperament or aptitude for it? It was because it was strewed. Okay, what does that mean? I was playing with something, a visual cue and a sensory cue of I'm just engaging with the beads, and he had the autonomy and he perceived equality to come over and look at it and engage with it or not. Okay, so that's what a strewed offering is, and we're going to go more into the definition, but this was one of my like first aha moments, and I was like, oh, and it makes sense with the root cause of PDA avoidance, which is a perception of either someone's above them in authority, power, or stature, or they perceive that they don't have autonomy around something. So what was happening with reading up until this point? I put so much pressure, so much expectations, he didn't have choice, and I was the one deciding, right? But when I was just doing something, engaging with beads with letters on them, his brain perceived safety because there was no neuroception around Mom really wants me to engage with these beads and learn how to read, or Mom is making me read, okay? Flash forward to now, my son is an avid reader. It still blows my mind because when he was in public school, he qualified for special education. He was not learning to read. We had to pull him from public school. And still to this day, I do not read to him. I do not ask him about reading. And I only engage with it when he comes up to me and he's like, "Mama, look at how many pages I've read." But I will say, and this hopefully for some of you out there gives you some hope, I was convinced and radically accepted, like my son might not learn to read at a certain point, okay? So that's the first example of like accidental strewing that made me start thinking about things differently through my observation of my son. The second is with eating. Okay, so I had dropped the demands on eating. We were no longer making him sit at the table. We were delivering food. We were not putting pressure on eating because that's his stickiest basic need and the thing that is most challenging for him. Okay, but then I would be eating something like sushi and he'd come over and like take the chopsticks and start poking it, right? Which like on the 32 steps of engaging with a food is actually fairly high up because he was getting like sensory and tactile interaction and smell with the sushi. And I was just like, what's happening? And then I would get barbecue takeout here in town and he'd like take a fry and dip it in the barbecue sauce. And I was like, what is happening? Right? So this was not the root cause of sensory. It was the perception that, oh, Mom has no expectation or desire for me to eat this food. In fact, she kind of doesn't want me poking her sushi with her chopsticks. And so there's a sense of felt safety and the ability to engage because this was just an accidental strew of food because the energy around it was truly not one of, I want to make my son eat sushi or barbecue. It was just like I was doing my own thing, okay? So this is what strewing is, and I'm going to define it for you. Well, first, why don't I tell you like historically where it is and how the term was coined, and then I'll say how it's adapted to PDA. Okay, so The first time I heard of and read about strewing as a technique, it was in the homeschooling milieu, the blogosphere of homeschooling, and the term was coined by a woman named Sandra Dodd. And I don't know her, I don't know much about her, but what I do know is that she has this definition where it's like leaving things out that a child can engage with or not when they want. So like in homeschooling, instead of having like, now we're going to do science, now we're going to do writing, having like a schedule and getting out the materials in an order, the strewing technique in homeschooling was like, maybe you have a table of science materials, maybe there's another area where there's art projects, and then there's maybe like a sensory table, and the child or teen can gravitate towards what their interests are in the order that they want. Okay, so for PDA, we have to take it a step further and remove the expectation that they engage with it at all. So the way that I think about it is a sensory-based cue in the environment that we can offer to the child without the expectation that they engage with it or not. So there's really autonomy, true autonomy, energetic autonomy, and a perception of equality, so that it's not like, I put these out and now you have to engage with it, okay? So strewing is one of 12 accommodations that I teach in depth in the Paradigm Shift program, which is currently open to the wait list only. And tomorrow, enrollment will open to the public. So if you are interested in practicing these skills in real life settings with me and a community of like-minded parents for 3 months, that is what we will be doing in the Paradigm Shift, among many other things. Okay, but let's go back. Oh, and it will be open until December 15th. So that's Friday. So if you are interested, either jump on the wait list and grab it now, or you have until December 15th or until the cohort fills, because we are quickly gaining lots of families. Okay, so let's talk about strewing in categories of how we can use it as parents, because I find it helpful to break things into categories for memory. Okay, so again, strewing is a sensory-based offering that we can use in the environment to cue our children or teens for engagement, for learning, for connection, without the expectation that they engage. Okay, so there's 3 types I like to think about. One is a visual strew, which is how it's traditionally used, which is what I described earlier for homeschooling, of like, I'm going to leave out these tables of, art supplies. But what with a PDA child, it has to be, or teen, it has to be like truly just an offering that it's okay if they don't engage. So for example, you may have noticed if you're in therapy with your PDA child or teen, or if you have gone to someone else's home or a store and they've seen something that they've like really wanted to engage with, and perhaps it's a toy, it's a puzzle, it's an art project, maybe it's even a food. Like this happened with us at OT recently, where my son was really interested in this carnation powder, which had all these vitamins and minerals, especially calcium, because he doesn't get any calcium and he doesn't really take vitamins. So he's like so into it, and this can happen with a toy too. And then what do we do as parents? We're like, yes, they're finally engaging with something. They want to play independently with something, or they want to eat something. So we buy it, or we stock up on it. And then we're like, look, I got you this type of chips that you loved. Or look, like that board game that you loved over at your cousin's house. Like I got it for us and we can play. And then they're like, no interest, reject it entirely. And they're like, I don't want to do that, right? And you're like, what? And it doesn't make sense. However, through the PDA lens, it completely makes sense, because even if they really liked it and want to engage with it, when we have an expectation around it, and even the slightest bit of pressure of like, I'm above you, I bought this, now it's time to engage with it, there's the perception through the survival brain, which remember is subconscious, where they perceive threat of like, a loss of autonomy or equality, which activates the nervous system, fight, flight, freeze, and then we see the avoidance, right? The root cause is nervous system activation, but we see the rejection or avoidance. So how can we accommodate this in a simple way? Strewing is a great technique where maybe you were at the cousin's house and you saw that they really loved engaging in, the game Sorry. And it's around Christmas time, so you're thinking about like purchasing them something. Maybe you, instead of giving it as a Christmas gift, which puts pressure on the engagement, maybe you purchase it and just leave it out, right? Or just put it on the shelf and just wait until they engage with it or not, or notice it, right? So there's just no pressure of like, we need to engage with this now, or I saw that you like this, so let's play it together, right? So that's a visual strew. The casually leaving out of things that they can engage with or not on their own timeline. It's imbued with autonomy. It's imbued with a sense of equality. And we as parents just have to work on our patience for when and how the engagement happens, okay? So sometimes you can do this more deliberately. Like, sometimes when my kids are on the screen for a really long time, I start to take out things to like bake, right? And sometimes they gravitate towards like, oh, mommy's doing something, so I'm gonna do it with her, and sometimes they don't. And that's okay. Okay, so that's a visual strew. Another type of strew is an auditory strew, which in the Paradigm Shift program, I teach the nuance of how to combine this with other accommodations and to use it to start to develop healthy self-concept. We build on all these skills to do really transformative shifts with our children, but it's hard for me to explain in one live, which is why I have a program that we practice this together. But an auditory strew, let me give you an example. I like to think of this as like a verbal trial air balloon or a little like verbal litmus test in the air, just to like collect data of like, is this of interest or is it not of interest? So you might find your child all weekend being like, I'm bored, but every time you suggest something like, oh, let's go to the park, let's go bowling, why don't we go to a store, why don't we call a friend? They're like, no, right? That's because, as challenging as this is to wrap your mind around as a parent, when you suggest something, there is the perception that you're above them or the loss of autonomy and choice, even by imposing like, these are the choices, right? Again, this is about neuroception. This is about the nervous system. This is not something your child is consciously doing to be manipulative or annoying, even though it can feel that way, okay? So when we ask direct questions like, what do you want to do this weekend? Or make suggestions, we're closing the number of categories, which can be perceived as a loss of autonomy. So one of the things I do to preempt this in my own home, and one of the things we practice in the Paradigm Shift program, is an auditory strew. So like on the weekend, instead of asking my child what he wants to do, I might just start looking up things on the computer. And I might be like, oh, it looks like the wellness center actually has a kids swim this Sunday. And it's like a little trial air balloon, auditory trial air balloon. Sometimes my son doesn't hear it. Sometimes he does. Or I might do an auditory strew with my husband where we're talking and I'm not like hushing my voice so he can hear, my son can hear what we're talking about and engage or not. Okay, so that's an auditory strew. And what this is doing is this is allowing your child to stay in the thinking brain so they can actually respond with their preferences, right? Because you may have noticed, like, my son is an automatic no for everything, right? Even when I use a lot of these accommodations. But the point is that, like, by using the accommodations, I bring down his nervous system activation, so he's spending more time in that frontal lobe where he can actually think. So he might say no, and I'm just like, okay, like, and I'm truly fine with it. And then as soon as he gets back into the thinking brain, he's like, okay, yes, right? And drop a heart if you've noticed that with your child. When they perceive felt safety and they're in the frontal lobe, they can actually think. Okay, the final strew that we can use as a shorthand for remembering is called, what I call, the U strew. So I think this is the most powerful strew because it combines the sensory cue of like something in their environment they can engage with or not, with a safe nervous system, which is yours. So this just means that instead of like leaving things out for them to engage with, which is more traditional strewing from homeschooling, it's actually that you start doing something as a you strew that they can engage with or not. And I have found, even when I'm not intentionally doing this, it's like whenever I'm doing something, like for example, the other day I was making this tea that I like to make with lemons, honey, and ginger, and like it's heated and it really warms my soul. But like as soon as I'm cutting the lemons, my son comes over and is like, let's make lemonade, and then I have to like divert and get like, a whole setup for him parallel to me. But I always like bring the sacred pause and patience to it because I'm like, he's engaging, he's learning how to cut the lemon. Like this is like such a co-regulation activity. It just means like I have to slow down and recognize that opportunity for engagement. But let me give you an example from working with a client when this was such a powerful accommodation because it really did shift things, but it took consistency and mindfulness. Okay. So I was working with a family who had 2 PDA tweens. One was externalized, one was internalized, and both needed to be home from school for a period of time in order to get out of burnout. So the mom's mother had moved from out of town in order to support her daughter because she couldn't do all of it by herself. So she moved close by and they had the externalized PDA who was largely doing his unschooling thing in the home. And then the internalized PDA would go over to his grandmother's house, but without the expectation that he was going to engage in learning, right? Because they were trying to get him out of burnout. And the premise was like, he can bring over his iPad, he can watch the iPad. And what grandma and mom and I worked on was, okay, every day we're just what your role is first, don't take it personally that he's not engaging with you. Second, reduce expectations and demands around whether or not he engages. So we're totally radically accepting that he might not and we're letting go. But grandma is going to set up some sort of activity nearby that she's engaging in. Right? So she is going to be baking cookies, or she's going to be doing a Sudoku, or she's going to be doing a puzzle, and the child on the iPad can engage or not. Right? So what happens? The first 2 or 3 weeks, the kid has no interest in coming over to see what grandma's doing, and she's consistent, and we're working through it, and she's committed to the letting go of and non-attachment of whether or not the child comes over. This is the ultimate use-strew of like, grandma is a sensory-based cue of something else going on that the child can engage with or not, and her nervous system is there too, right? So eventually, to everyone's surprise except mine, because I've been through this, I've worked with hundreds of families, I know that this works. Eventually, he started getting off the screen and showing interest in engaging with what she was doing, right? Okay, so this isn't, remember, like the key refinement of this type of accommodation is that we don't do the accommodations in order to get a response in the moment. We do the accommodations as a way of accommodating the nervous system so that consistently we're creating a new neural pathway back to the frontal lobe and reducing demands and expectations so that their nervous system can experience felt safety. And that is what over time leads to trust, connection, and engagement. Okay, so that is my teaching session for you guys, Coffee with Casey, on what strewing is, because I know there's a lot of new community members here, and I know that you guys have been asking about this because I've been seeing it in my DMs and comments. So again, this is one of the 12 accommodations that we practice in the Paradigm Shift program, which is a 3-month live program. The cohort is currently open to those on the wait list, and I'm opening to the public tomorrow if there are spots left. So if you would like to practice the skills you need in a like-minded community of parents who are making the paradigm shift together, I would love for you to join us. We run the program. It's our signature program 3 times a year. And this cohort, the live part of it, will start January 7th, 2024. So we'll start off the new year with shifts for your family. All right. And if you guys have any questions about strewing or about the program, that would be awesome. Yeah, so Indulge Nourish says, we use strewing in the unschooling model of education. Yeah, it's a great tool. It's a great tool. And the more you practice this stuff, the more it becomes second nature, but it can feel awkward, especially like when you first start doing the you strew, like where you're engaging with something and they're just continually ignoring you. It feels like nothing's happening, but you're actually signaling safety and autonomy because you're not pressuring them to engage. So like, I like to think of it as doing the accommodation itself is like moving you towards the transformation, not the child's response, right? Because you're signaling it's okay if you don't engage. I'm just here unconditionally, right? And then when they feel that safety from you and that non-attachment, then they come over and you start to have more of a virtuous cycle. We 100% did not pressure reading or food. The zero expectations has big time expanded engagement. Absolutely. And it's very hard because like when your child's not eating and they won't read, it's terrifying, especially with basic needs, like especially with eating, because you're like, how are you surviving without calories and vitamins and nutrients? So this isn't easy to implement, right? It's simple, but it's not easy to do consistently because the energy behind it is one of non-attachment. Strewing, leaving things out a child can engage with or not. Exactly. So remember, we have 3. We have visual strew, which is the traditional one. Auditory strew, which was when you put like a little sentence out into the ether and by osmosis, they may hear it and engage or not. And then the you strew, which combines your safe nervous system, and I like to think of it as the most powerful. Okay. I'm just seeing if people have questions. So good to see you guys. We hid it under my bed. He catches me pulling it out from under my bed and drinking it. Oh, this is mine. And then he will do it regularly. Absolutely, absolutely. Cindy said, yes, this is what I've learned to do. My son will approach it when he's ready to. Yeah. And so often actually, parents intuit this and they observe it and they notice it, but they doubt themselves and feel like they're doing it wrong. And so understanding that this is a tool, even if it's not a behavioral tool, can often help parents bring language to what they're already doing or want to do and help confidence, the feeling of confidence and being a capable parent, which you are, but so often we're made to feel like we're not, right? Okay, so Emma says, any tips for how to use this for homework? So homework is a tricky one, right? Because the point of transformation for a PDA child or teen happens only when the parent transforms first, which means truly letting go of whether or not they do homework before you start using this accommodation. So in the Paradigm Shift program, for example, before we get into the module of the 12 accommodations, we go through 3 weeks of radical acceptance and cost-benefit decision-making, because if we're using the accommodations in order to get the child to do homework, it will backfire, okay? However, let's say that you have truly let go of whether or not your child does homework. And I'm in this situation. My child has homework for his Montessori. I really wish they didn't have it. We've had many conversations with the school about it. And his teachers are amazing, but like their policy is that they do homework to practice their multiplication tables, they do vocab. And so even though my son knows, and we tell him over and over and over again, like, you do not have to do homework, it's okay, he perceives the expectation and wants to do it because all the other kids are doing it, right? So it's like this rock and a hard place. So one of the things that we do to strew is I might just like be taking the kids' stuff out of their backpack at a moment when I know he's in the area where he might have the visual or auditory cue of me like taking out his vocab book, right? And then it's like a cue. So like if your child has executive functioning differences, they might need that reminder, but if you remind them verbally with the expectation they do it, it's going to activate the threat response. So it's like we want to be using these tools to soften some of the expectations and things that they may feel they have to do, rather than as a parent getting them to do something, right? And I know that that's hard to hear because a lot of us want the accommodation to give us an outcome of like, now we use strewing and therefore they do homework. But that's not how it works. We use strewing regardless, all the time, consistently, not just when they're avoiding, not just when they're activated. And repeated, consistent, practiced, and mindful accommodations all the time is what lowers their cumulative nervous system activation from their threshold, creates neural pathways back to the thinking brain so that they can engage and do the things that they want and need to do. Okay, so I know that that's a little bit like taking a step back, but that's one of the things that we work through in the programs I teach of like, because often, it might work a little, but you're not going to get the transformation you want in your family if you're only scratching the surface and like trying to use accommodations to make your kid do things. That's why we have to go to the root, because what I'm interested in for all of you is like truly finding peace as a parent of a PDA child or teen, and truly getting them to a place where they are on the path to thriving as the best version of themselves. And so we can't just scratch the surface. Obviously, that's like part of what I teach here on social media is like how to use tools, and they're great. But we have to also focus on the energy and attachment behind them, or else we can never get fully unstuck with our kid. I see that we are automatically, as a gut feeling, try it and see what works. Okay. Yeah, oh yes, like you're talking about my son. Yeah. So, contrary to popular belief, PDA is a thing, it's a neurotype, and there are patterns, and it's consistent, and this isn't something that like anyone made up, or else it would be quite strange for me and other creators to just be like, yeah, we all see the exact same thing, right? I absolutely love use strews with my son. It's very successful, not all the time, but often. Yeah, so a small reframe for you might be it's always successful because every time you do it, you're moving into it with the energy of non-attachment, and even if he doesn't engage, allowing the autonomy of not engaging is the accommodation itself. Okay, and that's the seed that's planting over and over and over again. So again, we have to decouple our success as parents from the outcome in the moment, and understand that every time we do this, even if it doesn't get an outcome in the moment, it is building safety, and it is building trust and connection, and that is Those three things, the connection, trust, and felt safety, that is the foundation and premise for everything that will shift for you in your family. Will this be available to listen to later? So interested but can't stay. Yeah, so normally, depending on my lives, I usually turn them into a podcast. So it might take a couple weeks. But yes, we will have a podcast on strewing. Yes, I'm so glad. All right, my friends. Can you repeat what you said about how we don't accommodate with expectation? Okay, so like a place you might be getting stuck, and a pattern that I see from working with hundreds of families at this point and working for years in this space, and I saw it and recognized it in myself too, is that often we're using, even if we learn the tools, right? So like we're lowering demands, or we're strewing, or we're using declarative language. The energy behind it is still one of fixing or of getting an outcome, right? Like I'm going to strew this art so that my child engages independently. Or I'm going to strew stuff for homework so they do the homework. Or I'm using declarative language so that they answer me. Or, I notice your apple is still there on your plate in order to make them eat it, right? Like maybe at first those accommodations can soften some of the activation your child will have in their nervous system, fight, flight, freeze, from the perception that you're above them or trying to control them. But it's not going to go to a profound level of like felt safety, which is the foundation for shifting things with your child, which is true non-attachment. Using the accommodation to support their nervous system, not the outcome that it produces. Okay? Because remember, this is a long-term process. Accommodations used consistently, even in moments when they're not activated or when they're not avoiding or resisting, rejecting, or like having a meltdown, that's what transforms over time. And this is why we do this practice, experiment, track data for 3 consistent months to lay the foundation in the Paradigm Shift program for years to come. Okay? So it's only now, it's been like 4 consistent years with my son where I finally feel like the baseline is an activation. Like for years, I felt like most of the time, every interaction, every moment of his life was nervous system activation, fight, flight. And there were moments of more regulation, but they were not the baseline. And now he's finally at a place where the baseline is more regulation, right? Where he still activates, he still has meltdowns, I still need to accommodate him, but instead of it being a constant stimuli, constant, anytime he activated, it was constant equalizing fight, flight, meltdown. He has a window of tolerance, and he has more ability to operate from his frontal lobe. So that might mean when I have to set a limit or a boundary, he still activates, but he's not going to tip over into like not eating, having gastrointestinal issues, screaming, destroying things immediately like he used to, right? So he is still PDA, but in a cumulative sense, constantly, over and over again, practicing all of these accommodations consistently created a sense of felt safety and made it so that he wasn't constantly having a trauma or panic response. So it takes a lot of time. And through that felt safety, through that baseline of felt safety, then you can have connection and attachment and trust continue to build. And then that becomes your currency as a parent, right? But, there are things that still surprise me because for a long time I felt like my son didn't have any empathy and didn't care about my experience at all. And, you know, my friends would say, my friends who aren't in the PDA space, they're like, kids don't care about their parents' experience. Like, that's typical. So there probably is a degree of like, he's 8. So he's not thinking about you and your experience all the time. However, you know, like just this weekend, 2 times, both days, he got up, cut apples on his own, put honey in a bowl. This is from a kid who, like, we often still have to deliver food to him and get the remote for him and all the things. So he cuts the apples, he puts honey in it, and then he's seen me toast gluten-free bread, but he doesn't know that. So he took the regular bread, toasted it, and put olive oil on it. And they brought it up for breakfast in bed both days. And then he was like, Daddy, I didn't know what you wanted for breakfast, but I always see you eating apples, so I thought you'd like apples, and I picked 2 different apples for you. So like moments like that just blow my mind on so many levels, because he's like doing the skills that we've deliberately lowered demands on, right? So like taking out a knife and cutting an apple and putting honey in a bowl. He's empathizing, he's accessing that part of his brain that allows empathy because he's not in fight or flight. Perspective taking, and then he's communicating with us about it, and he's doing it with his younger brother. It's like mind-blowing to me. But like it took years and trust to get to this point, and it was totally counterintuitive. Because like I never sat down and was like, let's cut apples. And you know, like we had an au pair whose boyfriend lived with us for a couple months, and he had the energy of just like super chill, and he was so tall and fun, and the boys loved him, from Colombia. And I think he taught my son how to cut with a knife because he was a chef. And like I couldn't have taught him that because it would have been too direct, like I'm above you as the authority of a parent. But because this lovely man he's 23, had an energy of just like older brother mentor, he was a youth Strew making dinner in our kitchen, and my son came over and was like, can I learn how to do that? Right? Perfect example. And so, you know, we want to like teach our kids skills for independence and try and make them have empathy and like do all this therapy to communicate. And that's not always that could be the right decision for your kid, but like it's often what's preventing all of these things like skill acquisition, empathy, perspective taking, and communication is not necessarily the skills. It's that they're having a fight-flight response, which puts them in like the reptilian part of their brain, and they can't access executive functioning, rational thought, empathy. They can't communicate clearly, right? And when the cumulative nervous system activation comes down, we start to see a very different child or teen. Okay, so I hope that leaves you hopeful and trusting your process and understanding that this is long-term. It takes a lot of work and consistency and practice, but it is worth it because you are changing the trajectory of your child and your life. All right, everybody, thanks for being here with me on this, what day is it? Tuesday. I'm in the middle of a launch, so I'm like, what day is it? What am I doing? Anyways, it's always super exciting to see the next cohort fill up, but it's also, as a business owner, nerve-wracking because, you know, I never know how many people are going to join. And, you know, we're going to have a great cohort, and I'm super excited, but the first day of a launch is always a little nerve-wracking. So if the cohort doesn't fill up by midnight tonight, tomorrow it will be open to the public. I would love to see you there either this time or in May when we run it the next time. All right, everybody, have a good Tuesday. Bye.